This video covers Module 2, Part A, Qualitative Research. In this video, I'll talk about what qualitative research is and why a researcher would want to use it. I'll contrast it very directly with quantitative research so that you can see the distinction between those two approaches and when each would be most appropriate to use. And I'll talk about some different types of qualitative research techniques that are commonly used that you're probably familiar with, namely interviews and focus groups, as well as another group of qualitative research techniques called projective techniques that you might be less familiar with. Towards the end of the video, I'll talk about the way in which qualitative research data can be analysed, and this is going to be quite useful for us in AMB 201 because we've got a qualitative research project coming up where you're going to want to analyze interview data. So that'll be discussed fairly extensively within tutorials, but I also want to give a little bit of a grounding as part of this video prior to going into that. So what is qualitative research? We say that this is a group of techniques that aim to give the researcher a really rich, deep understanding of a particular phenomenon or of a particular issue. So here the researcher is really looking to understand the complexity of a topic. We say that with qualitative research, what we're hoping to achieve is an understanding of that topic from the participant's perspective. So when you go out and you conduct your interview as part of the qualitative project, what you're really looking to do is understand that topic from the point of view of your participant. You're not just looking to get answers to the questions on the page that you have, you're really looking to use those questions as a basis to probe your respondent in order to understand how they see that topic and get their perspective. That's what you're looking to understand. We say that qualitative research is inherently subjective. So whenever you go into a research setting to conduct an interview or something like a focus group, you're really bringing your own personal experiences, background, and your own biases to that setting. So the questions that you ask, the way that you ask those questions, that's all based on your understanding of that topic and also the people who are sitting in front of you. If you have younger participants, older participants, that can influence the questions that you ask. In addition to that, the way that you interpret your participants' responses is very much based on your understanding of things like verbals and non-verbals, the way something was said, and also what you remember from that experience. So it's very much a subjective type of research approach. Qualitative researchers very much see this as a strength of the designs that they use, because they say that when we go into a research setting, we can't understand it unless we bring our own experience to that setting. Quantitative research, on the other hand, tends to be a lot more objective in that we might send out a survey with very fixed questions that don't differ across people, with very fixed response options where people can't bring in any additional information. Quantitative researchers see qualitative research as problematic because of that subjectivity element, whereas qualitative researchers see it very much as a strength. Another key difference between qualitative and quantitative research is that qualitative research is typically based on small samples of people. If you're conducting interviews, you might only conduct 20 or 30 interviews in a project, or if you're running focus groups, a focus group may only have, say, 6 to 8 people, maybe 10 people. So it's a very small sample. What we're looking to do is understand that topic amongst that sample. With quantitative research, we use much larger samples. So we might send a survey out to thousands of people, for example. The aim with quantitative research is to get representative data and infer something about the wider population, whereas with qualitative research we're not looking to really generalize in that way, we're really looking to understand our sample. Because of that, we say that qualitative research is very much researcher dependent. So the type of interpretation you get out of your interview data is going to really be based on you as a person, what you bring to that interpretation, how you interpret the data that you're presented with. So with your qualitative project, you're going to be analysing 4 interview transcripts. Someone else in the class could analyse those exact same 4 interview transcripts and arrive at slightly different interpretations or extremely different interpretation. When we conduct qualitative research, we're really looking at participants' responses or verbal responses in interviews and focus groups, so what they say. We might also include other discussions that we have with participants outside the formal research setting, because really if that informs our understanding, then that's important. We can also include in this category of research observations that we make. So if we're interested in online shopping, for example, we might look at the way someone shops online as well as the discussions that we have with them. When we conduct an interview or a focus group, we might also observe non-verbal responses that people give. So if someone shrugs their shoulders, for example, or if they offer a response with a laugh or with a little bit of sarcasm, then you might want to note that down, because that obviously feeds into your interpretation. Beyond just discussions and notes that we make about observations, we can also analyze things beyond that verbal data. So qualitative research also includes things like analysis of images or the analysis of artifacts within a particular research setting as well. So I guess one thing to keep in mind when you're conducting your interviews and writing up your transcripts from that is that it's important to take note of the verbals, so what people say as part of that interview, but also the non-verbals that they give. So if people do pause for a long time, or if they laugh when they say something, you might also want to include a note about that, because that's also going to inform your interpretation of that data or someone else's interpretation of that data at a later point in time. So qualitative research contrasts very directly with quantitative research. Quantitative research is more focused on understanding or quantifying the extent to which something happens, or the extent to which people believe something, or they feel that they hold some sort of characteristic. So we look to apply those numerical descriptions in quantitative data, whereas we're looking to understand that verbal data in qualitative research. Quantitative research, we're looking to conduct statistical analyses, and we might look at the way different groups rate on some characteristic and differences there, or relationships between variables. With qualitative research, it's more that interpretive type analysis. As I've said before, most researchers, or I'd say many researchers, have a preference for qualitative or quantitative research, but we also have this mixed methodology that's also becoming more popular now. If you look at the diagram here, it's very much a quantitative type of research depiction. So here this is about hours of media consumption within Australian households, and you can see here that these households, or maybe it's individual consumers, are saying that they use or spend about 16 hours a week online, so it doesn't seem a whole lot. That's followed by 12 hours on TV, watching TV, 8 hours or 8.8 hours watching radio, and a quantitative researcher can come back and therefore say that internet is the most commonly used or most extensively used medium, followed by TV, radio, and so on. A qualitative researcher would look at that and say that that's very shallow. So we don't know why people are using the internet. Are they using it simultaneously with TV? What's the basis of the differences there? So we're not getting that really rich, deep understanding of the differences across those media usages there. So types of qualitative research to think about, and those that we're going to discuss today, are listed here. So we've got interviews, focus groups, and projective techniques, as I've talked about here. We're not going to be discussing case studies, but case studies are very much often based on interviews and focus groups. All right, so depth interviews is what you're going to be conducting for your qualitative project. These are essentially a one-on-one interview where you're looking to get that deep understanding on some particular topic. We say that any qualitative interview should generally be conversational if we want to elicit meaningful information from people and get a lot of information from them, so that we can interpret the world from their perspective, if you like. Try hard to always ask open-ended questions, so questions where people can't just respond yes, no, but instead are going to elaborate. So for example, here we could say, think of a recent service experience you had where you felt dissatisfied. Can you tell me about it? So with that, it's encouraging the person to elaborate. It's encouraging the person to respond in a fair bit of depth. If you had instead asked that as, have you had a recent service experience where you felt dissatisfied, someone could just respond yes or no. That would be a closed version of that question. We want people to elaborate. Now, During your interviews, the questions that you've got are very much open-ended questions designed to elicit information from your respondents. If people, however, don't respond with very much information, what you should be doing is probing them for additional content. So can you tell me more about that? What do you mean by what you've just said, or what else happened in that situation? Remember, your goal here is to understand that situation or that topic from their perspective. So really you do need to probe a little bit more, particularly if your respondents are not really forthcoming with a lot of information. As I said before, it's important to attend to both verbals and non-verbals. If someone says something with a little bit of laughter, perhaps they don't actually mean what they're saying. Perhaps they're being a little bit sarcastic, so we have to note that down. If someone sighs when they say something, or if they pause for a long time, that can be very important in understanding what the intention is that they're trying to convey. So when we write up a transcript from a qualitative interview or even a focus group, what's very important is to keep that very much verbatim. So we write down the exact words that they say, word for word. We avoid paraphrasing when we're creating that transcript, because paraphrasing would be putting our own interpretation on that dialogue prior to our analysis stage. When we conduct depth interviews, they typically tend to be what we call semi-structured, meaning that we have a general structure that we follow, a set of questions that we follow, just like we have for the AMB 201 qualitative project, but we're allowed to deviate from that. And that's important because what we want to do is get that additional information. We can't deviate too much from that though, because we do have those objectives that we're trying to address. So we want to make sure we do have a general structure, even though we're allowed some flexibility with that. If we go into a research setting without any structure, so we go into a conversation type setting in order to get information, we would call that generally an unstructured interview. And these do tend to happen. We call these conversations or research conversations. The value of that is that you do get a lot of information, and the conversation can go off in a range of directions and you can develop new insights. The difficulty with analyzing that sort of data, especially if you have 4 or 5 people that you've interviewed, or 20 or 30 people that you've interviewed, is that those interviews can differ considerably, and it can be difficult to consolidate themes across those or consolidate understanding across those. So unstructured interviews, useful for generating additional insights, difficult for drawing cross-case comparisons. The other extreme of that is having a fully structured interview, and this is more your quantitative interviews, where we have a set of questions whereby you as a researcher can't deviate from that script, and participants are also restricted in the way in which they respond. The value of that is that we can make very clear cross-case comparisons or comparisons across our respondents, but we often miss out on that additional information. Right? So if people haven't responded fully and you're not allowed to probe them further, then you can miss that additional information. So what we use within AMB 201 is what we call a semi-structured interview approach. Now, whenever we conduct depth interviews, they are very time intensive, and you'll learn this very quickly once you start to conduct your own interview for the project. So it might take half an hour to run your interview. In addition to that, you've also got the transcription time. So sometimes that can take 2 or 3 times as long as the actual interview to type that out, I guess depending on your typing speed and how clearly people have spoken in your recording, for example. The other thing that you'll notice once you come to conduct your interview is that the type of data that you get is very much dependent on your skill to elicit information from your respondent. So your ability to probe and get that extra detail that you're after. Some people are very good at this and some people less so. So you would have noticed this in life in general. Some people can have a very very good at having free-flowing conversations, and other people are a little bit more have a little bit more difficulty in getting that conversation going, and that's natural. Not everyone is suited to that sort of interaction. It also has the assumption that participants have a lot of insight into their own behavior and why they feel certain ways. So when you're asking someone, for example, why they might prefer to shop online as opposed to shop in a store, that person may have never really thought about the reasons for that. So on the spot, they have to come up with a response. If you ask people why they avoid social media, or why they enjoy using social media, or how frequently they use social media, if this isn't something that someone has thought of, they might not necessarily have insight into that, yet we're asking for that information from them. This is probably a bit of a criticism of all research in general. Quantitative research, for example, we commonly ask people to rate their opinion on a 7-point scale, where agree is up one end and disagree is down the other. If someone has never really thought about their opinion of Adidas, for example, or how that should be depicted on a scale of 1 to 7, then it's a little bit of an artificial task to ask them to do that, yet we commonly do. So whether or not participants have insight and whether or not they can articulate that or produce that within a research setting is something that we kind of assume they can, but it's probably something that we should question a little bit more. Other types of interviews are listed here, and I've mentioned conversations before. So where we have a fully unstructured interview, we could call that a conversation. Great for getting that additional insight, but having that limited structure can really limit the way we can go about analysing that data. We can also think about written interviews. So if we think about surveys that only have open-ended questions, these are very much qualitative surveys. Even though that they're written, they still constitute a form of qualitative interview. They can be quite useful to use because they can save a lot of time. You don't have to have a researcher present for those interviews, and you can get a lot of data very quickly. Moving beyond just depth interviews, we can also think about focus groups. Focus groups are really essentially a group discussion or a group interview. One thing I guess that's a little bit different is that you have a single moderator who is guiding the discussion for that group. And one thing that you might not realize if you're part of a focus group is that moderator is typically guiding you towards a particular question. So they might start out very broadly in the discussion that they try to elicit from you. So think about shopping in general. Where do you normally shop? Those sorts of things. But across the course of the focus group, they guide you to some focal question that may be their actual research question. So you might start off thinking very broadly about shopping in general, and then by the end of it, you're thinking about particular attitudes that you have towards brands that operate in the online context, for example. A good quality focus group requires a good quality facilitator to keep that discussion going, keep people on topic, and to ensure that the research objectives are addressed. This illustration is probably a nice depiction of what a focus group looks like. You have people sitting around a table just like this. Sometimes it's a smaller group than this. This is a fairly large focus group. You might have normally say 6 to 8 people. People might have props in front of them, so it might be different tasks on a piece of paper, or in this case where they're looking at a product, they might have the product in front of them. You can see the moderator off to the side guiding that conversation. All right, so a few points to note here. A focus group typically has 6 to 10 people. That's the ideal number of people. If you have too few people, you don't get enough information generated. And then if you have too many people in the group, then it can take too long to get around everyone and people start to get a little bit bored. We say that focus groups should be relatively homogeneous, and the term that I like to use is internally homogeneous, meaning that when we have a group of people within a focus group like this one back here, we try to keep the people as relatively similar to each other as possible. So it might be the same in terms of socioeconomic status or makeup. It might be in terms of age, or it might be in terms of gender. We try to keep the people as similar to each other as possible, and that's because we want people to feel comfortable with the people around them, so that they're happy to generate responses. They're happy to discuss how they feel, and so forth. Advantages of running a focus group as opposed to conducting an interview is that you get a lot of data very fast. So typically we would say within a focus group that has 8 people is that you won't get 8 times as much information as 8 individual interviews. You'll get a lot more because people often build off each other with their ideas, so you get a lot of information really quickly. They're relatively easy to execute if you have an effective moderator. So once someone knows how to run a focus group and they're quite good at that, they're fairly easy to execute. We have this benefit of people piggybacking off each other with their ideas. So someone mentions a topic that may not have come up, or an idea that may not have come up if you had just run a series of depth interviews, and then someone else builds off that idea and you get additional insights that way. You get a lot of different perspectives as opposed to with one-on-one interviews where you're just getting that one person's perspective. And as it says here, you cover multiple topics very quickly because you've got that conversational flow going in those good focus groups. Drawbacks, however, as I've said before, that you do require capable moderators. One thing that probably needs to be raised a little bit more with focus groups that we tend to overlook and not discuss enough is that they can often lack representativeness. So when we run a focus groups, for example, you might run a focus group on the way people feel about the national broadband network. Right? Typically these focus groups are constituted of people who live in cities or who live in large regional areas. So people who live out in the bush often miss out, and that's not because we're trying to exclude them. It's just that when you run a focus group, you typically hold it somewhere where you're likely to get people turning up and where it's easy for people to get to. So these are often run in cities or in large regional areas, so you do get that urban bias. You can have group dynamics that come into play that do limit the way information is generated. So you might get a single person start to dominate the conversation. You also have this bandwagon effect that a moderator has to be careful of. So where one person says something and other people start to say the same thing just because that person is dominant or just because they can't be bothered thinking. So there's a little bit of social loafing can happen in focus groups if the moderator isn't careful as well. One thing that crops up with focus groups is that they can be quite expensive. So if we go back to this depiction back here, what I would say is that with a focus group, we tend to compensate people for their time based on what they would be earning if they were in employment in that time. So if you're running a focus group with say housewives, for example, then you'd compensate them what they might be paid if they were in a domestic duties type role. They can become quite expensive if you're running focus groups with people from jobs that are in specialty occupations, for example medical specialists or law professionals, where those people might require payment of $200 or $300 an hour for their time, so they can become really quite expensive. All right, one other issue to be aware of is that we have this idea of professional respondents. Because focus groups are a paid form of research, we do often get people turning up to all the focus groups that they can. It's seen as very easy, so people can come along, they're happy to be asked their opinion, they're happy to offer their opinion. We term these people professional respondents. They come along to as many studies as they can. And while that's a really good thing and that we can get data from these people, one of the limitations is that we only get data from those people, right? So when we conduct a focus group, what we want to ensure is that we get a good spectrum of opinions. We don't want, Cheryl from Inala to come along and respond to all of our research topics because we want more opinions than just those from Cheryl from Inala. And as you'd know from any large setting where you may have been asked to disclose information or discuss your perspective, sometimes people can tend to feel a little bit shy or unwilling to disclose information, particularly if it's on a sensitive topic. So the moderator has to be mindful of that. One way that we do try to get around that is through these one-way mirrors, or also termed two-way mirrors. I think both terms tend to be used, where the researcher or the person taking notes or transcribing what's going on may be seated behind that mirror so that they don't influence the types of responses that people give, and so that people feel a little bit more comfortable. Obviously at the start they know someone's watching them from behind the mirror, so they may be a little bit more guarded, but over time people tend to desensitize. So that's a fairly common approach if you bring people into one of those research settings like that. Other types of group discussions beyond just those in-person focus groups would be online focus groups, and this can be a great way for getting around that urban bias issue. So you can readily purchase discussion platforms like this, and that can be great for getting a diversity of opinions. One thing you notice with online focus groups though is that you miss out on some of those piggybacking or other group dynamics that can happen with ideas. You see in online focus groups very commonly people are much more polite and will wait to be asked for their opinion rather than just getting involved in a natural flow of discussion. So that can be a bit of a downside with online focus groups, but certainly they help to overcome that urban bias. Social networks or social discussions on social networks or within social media can also constitute a type of group discussion that can form the basis for qualitative research. So if you think about Coles or Woolworths posting a question on their social media page, and then across time you get dozens and dozens of people responding, not only to the question but also offering comments to responses given by other people, this is very much a group discussion that's, I guess, disjoint across time. So we can get a lot of information from analysing that sort of group discussion as well. One thing to be mindful of with social media is that it's still an emerging area. It becomes a little bit of a grey area from a research perspective because people are interacting in a public setting but treating it as a private setting. So the question becomes, should we be analysing it or should we not be analysing that data? You get some researchers that do and some researchers that won't touch it at all. So there are some ethical considerations that need to come into play there. Is it likely that the person knew that they would be observed or that their data might be analysed? Should we seek consent from that? Those sorts of questions are going to crop up, and very often the answer to those things is yes, we do need to seek their permission. All right, another group of qualitative techniques are termed the projective techniques. Now, projective techniques are a group of techniques that we can use where we think that respondents may feel a little bit uncomfortable answering something in relation to themselves, or where they might be able to provide additional insight by being asked to project their ideas or project their thoughts onto some third party or onto some inanimate object. And you'll see what I mean by that in a moment. So this is very handy with controversial topics or sensitive topics where people might not want things attributed to themselves even though they raised them. One thing I'll say about projective techniques is that validity for them is in some instances a little bit questionable. They're commonly used within marketing research, not only for understanding an issue or getting additional insight, but also just to get people talking within a group setting or within an interview type setting. So they're quite useful for promoting discussion. So as I go through these, just remember, take them with a grain of salt and be very conscious when you encounter them in the future, in that the validity for them isn't always there. So the first one to be aware of is what we call the third person technique, and this is where someone might not feel comfortable answering about a topic in relation to themselves. So what we ask them to do is to answer how they think someone similar to them might perceive that issue or might react to a particular topic. Right? So the example here is quite a good one. So you as a researcher might be interested in the things that people use the internet for, and specifically you might be interested in more of those illegitimate uses like downloading pirated movies and music, those sorts of things. So you say to a respondent, can you tell me what you use the internet for? And they might come out with very acceptable or socially desirable responses where they say, well, I use it for emailing, chatting with friends, banking, and so on. So you then as a researcher say, well, okay, can you think of a friend who uses the internet a lot and what sorts of things might they use it for? Or you might say someone like yourself or your neighbors, what do you think they might use it for? And it's in those instances that people tend to be more forthcoming with other things that they're aware of. So in this case, I have a lot of friends who download pirated movies and music. So the caution here for a researcher is not to overinterpret what's being said. So it may very well be that this respondent doesn't download pirated movies or music. They're just aware that that this tends to happen, right? And that's a valid response. So as a researcher, you have to be cautious about over-interpreting that and then suggesting that that respondent themselves does these things, that they're projecting their own behavior onto someone else. But certainly that's a way to elicit information. We see this sort of technique used fairly commonly with things like, with controversial topics like smoking. Domestic violence is another one where it comes up. Drinking, drink driving is another one. Those social marketing topics, they're fairly common. So with smoking, if you ask someone who smokes reasons why they smoke, often they will give fairly socially acceptable responses, or responses that present them in a favorable light, and they say, well, I enjoy it, or I do it for social reasons. But if you ask them why they think most young people take up smoking, then they raise the issue of things like peer pressure, right? So you can get this additional insight from those people by using this third person technique. Just be mindful not to over-interpret the data that you get. They are very useful with children. Now, this is for a few reasons. Firstly, children don't always have the ability to articulate or express themselves adequately, but children are also very prone to what we call social desirability bias. So saying something that they think the researcher wants to hear, or that they think presents them in a positive light. So the depiction here is of some research that was conducted by Bettina Cornwall a few years ago now, and what she was interested in was the way in which children associate certain brands with being popular or being unpopular. Now, she used to be based in Brisbane, and now she's based at the University of Oregon, but this is a very nice study that illustrates those projective techniques quite nicely. So the idea of asking a child if they consider a brand to be associated with popularity or no, not being popular, is probably a little bit difficult. So a projective technique that was suitable for that sort of research was one as illustrated here. So the child is presented with a bunch of brand pairs and given a description of another child. So in this instance, Sigrid has a lot of friends and Sigrid's always happy. Which food does Sigrid normally eat? And then the child will pick the brand associated with that. And then we've got Baisha. Baisha doesn't have many friends, and sometimes Baisha gets sad. So which food do you think Baisha normally eats? And then the child picks one of the other, or presumably the alternative brand. Here you're getting the child to project popularity and lack of popularity onto each of those brands, and then across a number of trials with that child and across a number of children, you start to see which brands are associated with the more popular description as opposed to the unpopular description. And that was quite important research that Bettina did using that technique, where she found that, in contrast to what a lot of the literature was saying around that time, that children actually develop these brand associations of things like being popular and unpopular at quite a young age. Up until they conducted that research, the thinking was that children didn't really form those associations until they were about 6 or 7 years of age. And what they showed in that research was that a number of children actually developed those ideas as young as 3. So that's really quite young, that children are associating brands like McDonald's or Hungry Jack's with being popular. So that's a bit of a concern. And that has strong public policy implications, because that can then impact on the age at which advertisers are allowed to market to those children. So quite important research using those techniques. Another research that falls under this projective category that's possibly a little more ambiguous in terms of its validity is the thematic apperception test, or it's commonly known as the TAT. And this comes from research, a research methodology that is from Freudian psychology or psychoanalytic psychology, whereby people are presented with an image or a picture and then asked to interpret what's going on in that picture. So within marketing, the idea is that we might look at things like positive or negative descriptions that they come up with. Within psychology, the descriptions that people come up with in relation to these images are suggested to be able to give an insight into their personality or their subconscious, for example. So if you look at where they originally come from, it's the Rorschach ink blot tests, which look like this here, which I'm sure you've seen depicted in movies and so forth, where a person is given an image and asked what do they see in that image, and often the description is something really sinister or seedy, and that suggests something about their underlying thought process or their personality or whatever. Now, a point to note here is that even within psychology, these aren't seen as a particularly valid method for inferring anything. What they are quite useful for is getting conversation going and discussing a particular topic, so getting people talking. Within marketing, they can be used, as I said, to get people talking, but also to help us to understand how people perceive a situation, whether it's positive, negative, how they think about particular brands or ideas when they're presented with an image. So for a tourism campaign, for example, a participant might be presented with an image like the one shown here, right? And they might be asked, what do you think is going on in this situation? What led up to this situation? What do you think is going to happen next? And you can see how that could then inform a tourism campaign, for example, for somewhere like, say, Tasmania. You might ask what happened in that situation. The respondent might say, well, he's de-stressing, or he's trying to get away from the hustle and bustle. Right? And then that might inform how a marketing campaign is developed. Or someone might say, I bet he's annoyed because he can't get a signal out there, which would then suggest that there's a certain segment of people that, even though they want to get away, obviously want to stay in contact or online. You could think about the way different demographics or certain segments of consumers respond to images. So if you used a thematic apperception test with this type of image, right, and say what happened in this situation, or what led up to this situation, what do you think's going on here, a younger demographic might give responses based on things like overspending or credit limits or debt or something like that. Older consumers with this type of image probably more likely to provide responses based on perhaps privacy or online fraud or identity theft, especially given we've got a laptop in the background. So this can give a little bit of insight. These sorts of tasks or tests can give a little bit of insight into differences across demographics and insight into the way people associate certain things with different types of topics. But again, we have to be mindful that just because someone is describing a topic in this way doesn't necessarily mean that always applies to themselves. So we have to be a bit careful there. In general, we can think about qualitative research as having a number of strengths. So whenever we have a very complex phenomenon, that can be quite useful for getting at that, the thoughts and feelings that people have in relation to that, so we can get at people's perspectives. If we just run a survey where we list out 20 questions, then we've chosen those questions. People can't always provide elaborate responses, so we don't always get that depth of insight. Right. So we can get those additional insights. It's quite useful for natural settings where we want to see concepts emerge from our participants, and it's quite useful for very ideographic situations or very idiosyncratic situations. So you think about situations where you can't conduct a survey because there's not a large number of people who that situation applies to. I had a master's student a few years ago who was interested in the way politicians make policy on the run, so without being well informed on public opinion and stuff like that. And it's not the case that there are thousands of people that you can survey about that, because there's not that many people that have been in situations to make policy on the run. So he came into that research topic wanting to conduct quantitative research, but really what was necessary was the qualitative research, because it's quite an idiosyncratic or ideographic situation. So it's quite useful in that it allows participants to elaborate on their own experiences. It also allows the researcher to probe further into that topic or that issue based on their own personal understanding and ideas about what's important, and it lets them get that really rich detail. In terms of limitations, though, there are subjectivity issues, so we can always criticize this type of research as being too subjective. So did the researcher ask questions in a way that guided the respondent to give the the answers that they gave, that's a bit of an issue that we have to think about. It's limited in terms of generalizability. So if we've only collected data from, say, 4 people, as you're going to do with your qualitative project, then can we really say much about whether or not everyone holds those opinions? Qualitative research isn't always conducted with the aim to be generalizable, but certainly we could criticize it as being really limited in that we've understand our group of 4 people very well, but now what do we do with that information? It can be really time intensive compared to something like a survey where we can get thousands of responses really quickly, and can be prone to researcher misinterpretations. We've also got this issue that kind of feeds into all of those ideas, in that if you're a researcher sitting in an interview setting asking people questions, or in a focus group setting, or you're asking people to take the third person perspective, then the way in which you ask those questions, or your very presence in that setting, can very much influence the responses that you get. So the impact of the researcher on the research setting is a big one. All right, and just to round out this section, I want to spend a few minutes talking about the way in which qualitative data can be analysed. Now, if we think about quantitative data or survey data, really we can't analyse that data until we get all of our data collected, until all of our surveys come back, so that we can take an average across our responses and so forth. With qualitative research, that's very different. So our analysis is really starting during the data collection process. So as you're interviewing your respondents for the qualitative project, you will already be starting to get ideas of themes and insights that are being generated as you're interviewing them, right? And then you ask additional questions about that. So really your analysis is happening in your mind as you're collecting that data. I guess one of the other things to keep in mind is that your data does grow very quickly. You're transcribing what people have said, you're making observations about non-verbals and stuff like that, so your data can get really quite substantial very quickly. You're only going to be analysing 4 interview transcripts for your project, but you can imagine if you're conducting 20 or 30 interviews or 20 or 30 focus groups, that data that's generated can grow almost exponentially. So it can be quite time consuming to analyze that. We'll be analyzing that data by hand, but just be aware that there are packages for analyzing qualitative data as well, so software to assist you with doing that. 2 of the big ones are listed down here, NVivo and Leximancer, and these are software packages that we teach in the unit that I referred to in the last module, which is AMB 305. So if you do find that you're interested in qualitative research, but the idea of analyzing masses of data is a bit of a turn-off, just be aware that there are software packages out there to assist you as well. But certainly learning to do it by hand is a very useful way of going about it. So what is the general process for analysing qualitative data? We start off with essentially reading, rereading and rereading our data. So when you get your 4 interview transcripts, so yours and 3 others, what you should be doing is reading those over a number of times. The idea is that you read those interview transcripts over enough times that you would consider yourself intimately familiar with the content of them. So if I came up to you and said, did anyone mention the concept of convenience? You would be able to say, yes, respondent 2 mentioned that in relation to question 5, and respondent 3 mentioned that in relation to question 7. Once you're familiar with the data, we engage in what's called coding, and this is really composed of 2 stages. Firstly, chunking, and then assigning labels to those chunks, which we call codes. So when you read through your transcripts, what you're going to do is identify chunks of information that have been raised by your respondents. These might be single words, they might be sentences, or they might be statements, entire paragraphs, or simple phrases, anything that would constitute an individual piece of information. That might be, for example, someone might raise the concept of fraud if you're talking about online shopping, or they might raise the concept of privacy, and you'd go through and maybe circle that or highlight that to identify that as a chunk of information. Once you've gone through and created all of those chunks of information across all of your interview transcripts, you go back and label them. You say this chunk of information relates to privacy, this chunk of information relates to fraud, this chunk of information relates to convenience, right? So that you've then got a set of transcripts that have been chunked and also coded, or labels applied to those codes. Some of the codes that you develop or that you identify will be based on your general understanding from past reading or theories that you're aware of. So we know that in relation to online shopping, that privacy and fraud and convenience are going to be important ones, so that you might start to look for those. And other codes will be ones that emerge from the data that you might not have thought of. So something around peer pressure, for example, that might crop up and you weren't aware of that, but that has been generated as a code based on your reading of the interview transcripts. Once you've got all of those codes, you start to look for general themes across them. So can you see that they group together in certain ways, and you might then have 25 codes that then group together in 6 different themes, and then you'd be able to talk about those themes in relation to the general research question. So a coded document may look something like this. So I'm sure we've all naturally done this with highlighters in the past, perhaps in high school when you're going through analyzing a text or something like that, where you've gone through and said, oh, this is a chunk of meaningful information, and these few words here represent a chunk of information. Right? If you're using highlighters, you might highlight chunks of information that relate to a common theme in the same way, so that you can see how frequently that crops up. Keep a note of the way in which you're using that color coding if you're using highlighters. Tutors will go through these a couple of different approaches during tutorials, so certainly using highlighters is one way to do it. Using the comments function within Word is another way that tutors will demonstrate during those classes. There's no one right or wrong way of doing it, as long as you're very methodical and consistent and thorough in your approach. In terms of grouping those codes into common themes, what you can do is use something like a mind map. So if we look at what a mind map is, right, I'm sure most people are familiar with a mind map, where you have the different circles that link different concepts together so that you can see how they relate to each other. Or you might use a hierarchical approach like the one here, in order to see how the different codes that you've identified come together as a common theme. So here in this example, if we had asked our respondents about the reasons they engage in higher education, codes we may have arrived at is to get a better job, to please our parents, to do well for myself, and to learn something new. We could say that these two group together as intrinsic motivation, so motivations internal to the person, and then motivations that are extrinsic, so those related to the external world. Right? So you can see that they form a common theme, these two form a common theme, and together they form the higher order theme of motivations. And then in relation to that topic, you'd start to talk about motivations to study as being an important reason for people choosing higher education, if that were your topic. So again, there's no one right or wrong way to do this. You can use tree diagrams, you can use mind maps, whatever works for you in order to create those themes out of your codes. In AMB 201 for our qualitative project, we generally recommend that you use something like a coding table, perhaps as an appendix, or it might even be within the body of your report, in order to summarize and provide some evidence for the themes that you're arriving at. And that provides a little bit of support for the interpretations that you have. So over here, you've got examples from your transcript that correspond to each of the codes. Right? Our code here is to learn something new. We've got a description of what that code represents and an example, and you can see that that fits under the higher order theme of intrinsic study motivations. Here, to do well for myself also falls under intrinsic study motivations. We've got what that code means and an example. So you can see that that provides a very methodical way to support the interpretations that you've arrived at with your research. So just because we're conducting qualitative research and we say it's researcher dependent, doesn't mean we don't have to justify the interpretations that we have. We do so very much through things like this within our reports. Once you've gone through and analyzed your data, you've got your codes and you've created your themes from that. You know how you're going to respond or address the research objectives and answer the research question. You're going to write up your report. Now, when you write up your report, in qualitative research, it's a little bit like you would have responded or written up an English essay about Shakespeare or something like that, where you provide a quotation within the report. So you might talk about convenience seeking being an important theme that people raised in their interviews, and then you might provide a quote within the text. Overall, your summary or your discussion should be interpreting what information the data has provided in order to answer that overarching research question that you have. In terms of judging the credibility or trustworthiness of qualitative research, there's a number of things that we can come back to. And you can think about this and how well you're addressing these criteria when you're writing up your own report. So we've got four criteria that we can look at, and that is whether the research can be deemed credible, dependable, confirmable, or transferable. So in terms of credibility, we say that this is the extent to which the research rings true with participants. So if we were to take those research findings back to our participants, would our participants agree that the researcher has interpreted them correctly? If so, we say that their interpretations have credibility. So this is an important one. It's dependable if your supporting sources like this are sufficient enough that another researcher would be able to look at those and arrive at the same interpretations. So we do want to have good supporting evidence for the interpretations that we have in order to claim that our research is dependable. Similarly, have you kept enough records that someone else can confirm that the data that you have and the interpretations that you have are valid? So do you have the raw data records? Have you kept those somewhere? So in which case someone can confirm your findings. And this final one is links to that idea of research being generalizable. Have you written it up in such a way that someone else could look at your data and know whether or not it applies to another situation? We're not necessarily always aiming for data in qualitative research to be transferable, but someone should be able to look at your report and know whether you could transfer your claims or generalize your claims to another setting. So when you're writing up your report, think about whether or not you've provided enough information that someone else could judge whether or not your findings are credible, dependable, confirmable, and transferable. All right, so that's the essence of qualitative research. The next video is going to discuss observational research.